No, declare that carried. So this is where we're looking at the intensification provisions, but not in full. As the Chief of Strategy mentioned before, we're not dealing with the other areas. We're dealing with city centre, metropolitan centres, and the RTN. Okay, it's not the other areas. That's a body of work. I think we're going to see that in August, aren't we, John? So for this, we have back with us John Duguid, and we have Noel Reardon, who's our manager at Heritage. Welcome, Noel. I think Phil Reid might be in on this one as well, if need be. Phil is our manager of Auckland Wide Planning. Erin Shields, possibly. No, not at the table. Emma Rush, our senior advisor in special projects, and Alistair Gribbins from our Transport Strategy Unit as well. So I'm going to hand to John at the outset.
Great, thanks for that introduction. So we've had a couple of workshops on this topic of intensification around the walkable catchments. So you'll be reasonably familiar with some of this content. So we've condensed the workshop material into a smaller number of slides, but really the key headline here is that the NPS Urban Development requires this council and other Tier 1, that's the high growth councils of Wellington, Christchurch, Tauranga and Hamilton, to notify a plan change to their district or unitary plan in our case by next August. So we're really seeking direction here from you today on approaches to help us as staff really get going on the technical work to then start bringing things back to yourselves, local boards, mana whenua and key stakeholders. The engagement, specific approach to engagement is something that we're still working on, so we'll bring a report to you next month with a bit more detail around who we would recommend engaging with and how and roughly when and on what in terms of this work between now and next August. So, as the Chair mentioned and Megan as well, this is just one part of the intensification provisions in the NPS Urban Development. NPS Urban Development talks about walkable catchments and intensifying in those walkable catchments of the city centre, our 10 metropolitan centres, and the rapid transit network, which is the train lines, train stops, and the Northern Busway. And then it goes on to talk about in all other urban areas. So we'll come back to you in August with a separate report on how to address all other areas. So this is really focusing on the areas with the highest density of commercial and civic activity, that's the city centre and the metro centres, and the sort of highest frequency public transport. So NPS Urban Development is quite specific about areas where the highest degree of intensity should be enabled in the unitary plan. And maybe just to quickly reflect on the unitary plan as it stands, as you're probably well aware, in 2013 when the plan was put out for submissions, there was a significant relaxation of height controls and density controls right across urban Auckland. So huge amount of additional capacity was created for housing and business development under the unitary plan in 2013 when that plan was put out for submissions, and then through the submission and hearing process and then back to council decision making in 2016, that capacity was increased even further. And I guess the Housing and Business Assessment report that you've just heard about is reinforcing and just confirming the significant amount of capacity that was created. But for the reasons that Jacques mentioned, and also because of the clear direction in the NPS Urban Development, we have to relook at these issues again and undoubtedly make a plan change next August that does create significantly more development capacity. So in terms of the walkable catchments, two key components, and then there's a sub-component to the second one. So the first one is, what is a walkable catchment, and how are we recommending we define that or provide a guide around what a walkable catchment is, and what are some of the qualifying matters? That's a phrase. Qualifying matter is a phrase in the NPS Urban Development that says, notwithstanding the heights that the NPS Urban Development requires on these walkable catchments, councils can modify, reduce the height controls potentially have some density restrictions on housing in areas where allowing the heights that we'll talk about again in a second would compromise the value or the matter that is protected as a qualifying matter. And so within that, we're going to talk specifically around special character, because special character areas are the areas that align very closely with the walkable catchments in many cases and do constrain development to significantly lower heights and lower densities than the NPS urban development is indicating would be required. So walkable catchments, recommendations, Roman numeral I and capital A, B and C in the report. So in terms of the city centre, as we've workshopped with you, based on a lot of case studies, research, analysis that Alistair Crippens here is probably most familiar with in terms of staff within council anyway, has informed this recommendation that approximately around about 1,200 metres from the edge of the city centre is what would be a typical walkable catchment, an area that that the average person would be quite prepared to walk for the goods and services and amenities, civic functions provided by the city centre if you were living within 1,200 metres or thereabouts. In terms of the metropolitan centres, we have 10 of those identified in the unitary plan and in the Auckland plan. They start with Albany in the north, Westgate, Henderson, Takapuna, Newmarket, Botany, I'll miss a few unfortunately, Manukau, Sylvia Park, Newland. I think that's the 10. So those are the 10 of the centres in the unitary plan that have the highest height controls and so on. So the recommended walkable catchment of the metropolitan centres is approximately 800 metres from the edge of the zone boundary. And the third tier of walkable catchment in the NPS urban development is the walkable catchments of the rapid transit network, which is the rail network in urban Auckland, and also the Northern Busway stations. So as with the metropolitan centres, we're recommending, based on literature from overseas, research and some census data as well, that Alison has looked into, a walkable catchment of around about 800 metres from those transport stops. However, a key point here is that if the unitary plan was zoned purely based on those distances, we would have a series of circles around those centres and stations, and that's not the approach that we're recommending at all. We're saying that there needs to be some detailed place-based, centre by centre, station by station analysis to work out a more logical boundary of where that approximate 1,200 metres and approximate 800 metres might be. In some cases, it may go a bit beyond the 800, but probably in many cases, it's likely to be less than 800 because of factors like perhaps at 600 metres from a station, you hit a major arterial or perhaps a motorway, which creates a pretty serious barrier. So it wouldn't make sense to then on the other side of it apply, increase the height limits through rezoning the unitary plan when there's that severance or barrier to crossing it. There may also be very steep topography around some of these areas which would limit or which really have an influence on that 800 metres. So we're calling those modifying factors. They are in the recommendations in the report. So those are things that when a site by site, station by station, centre by centre piece of work is done, and a more logical boundary might be drawn. So what isn't really covered in the slides, and it's a bit of an omission here, is that these are the areas that the NPSUD says should allow for at least 6-storey development. So just to be clear, that's within these walkable catchments is the areas where there should be at least 6 storeys enabled. And in the unitary plan at present, there will be some streets, groups of properties within those walkable catchments that already allow for 6 storeys or more, but the majority of land within the walkable catchments in most cases is zoned for 2, 3, and in some cases 5 storeys, but not 6 or more. So that's the significant change that's foreshadowed through the presentation today. So in terms of qualifying matters, where a qualifying matter exists, that's where council has the ability to specify a lower height limit than 6 storeys. But areas that are subject to qualifying matter may still require an increase in height limit compared to what's in the unitary plan at the moment. It's not a case of saying, in this part of the walkable catchment, we have a qualifying matter, so we're not amending the unitary plan at all. The NPS urban development requires you to provide the maximum height possible without affecting a qualifying matter that council has determined to be of value. The example we've given on that before is if there is a volcanic view shaft that's perhaps sitting at about 5 stories over a street or property, and the current zoning only allows for 2 stories, if it's in a walkable catchment, the NPS urban development would require 5 stories. So it would require a change in height, because up to 5 stories, the view shaft is not being compromised. So that's probably the best example we can give there. So just moving on to the proposed qualifying matters, the NPS urban development lists, I think it's 7 matters that are almost automatic, and they're ones that tend to be things of national significance as defined in the RMA, things like the volcanic view shafts, significant infrastructure that will be compromised if additional height was provided in that vicinity, the management of significant natural hazards, so increasing the development potential where an area of land within a walkable catchment is subject to a significant natural hazard. These are the sorts of things that automatically the NPS urban development says that a council can exempt them from the 6 stories. But in addition to that, the NPS urban development allows council to add any other matter that it deems is appropriate. So we've listed in the agenda report attachment A the matters that we're recommending would be eligible as qualifying matters, and then we have also recommended some other matters which should also be qualifying matters. So just a note there that we do have to, for every qualifying matter, there has to be a piece of analysis done on the impact that that has on housing capacity as a result of keeping the height restrictions below the 6 stories. So just moving on to special character. So special character areas are not automatically listed in the NPS urban development as a qualifying matter. For the special character areas in Auckland, and that's the older, I've got a good slide here. So where you see the darker outlined streets and properties and neighbourhoods, those are the areas that are identified in the unitary plan as being of special character. The height limit is generally 2 stories. The density is restricted to generally 1 dwelling per site. There's flexibility for an additional dwelling, minor dwelling at the rear, and the conversion of an existing older house into 2 flats. So potentially you could have 3 dwellings on some of these sites. But it's roughly 30,000 properties. It is the older inner suburbs generally of Auckland, and they are very closely aligned with the very areas, the walkable catchments that the NPS urban development is signalling should allow for at least 6 stories. So clearly quite a bit of tension there, but our recommendation is that where special character areas are surveyed and assessed as being of high value, high quality, not value in terms of price, but high value in terms of the special character values that they represent, then those areas should be retained. Where, through the survey work that's already underway, areas are identified as being moderate or low quality, special character, then they shouldn't be eligible for qualifying matter and restricting development to the 2 stories they currently do. So in those cases, the recommendation will be to apply the NPS urban development as intended and enable the additional height. As an exception to that, we are recommending that when this work progresses, if we identify situations where retaining the high quality special character areas is having a significant impact on housing capacity and housing choice and opportunities in these locations, then a more site-by-site, area-by-area investigation would need to take place and a balance struck between retaining the high quality special character and enabling the additional height as intended by the NPS urban development. So at this point in time, we certainly can't tell you even approximately how many situations that might represent. We certainly can't tell you what proportion of the 30,000 properties in the character overlay would be high, medium or low. That's a big piece of work that's now underway. So really just run through this already, but we do have some non-residential areas, so some business areas, some of the older main streets and some of the older town centres in Auckland are identified as special character business. In those areas, if they're in a walkable catchment of a station or the city centre or a metro centre, we feel that there is potential to, if the height limit is below 6 stories, at the moment we feel there is potential to potentially allow up to 6 stories in a manner that retains the character of it, and that might mean setting the upper parts of a new building back from retaining the front portion of the older building. So for the business areas, we're recommending that potentially that 6 stories is quite achievable. But in the residential areas, and this is just to recap on what I've said, if it's of high quality, then retain it, which is generally keeping that single house zoning with the 2-story height control. If it's overall medium or low, then apply the NPS urban development heights of 6 stories or more. Unless there's another qualifying matter, there might be a view shaft over one of these areas that's below 6 stories, we would be recommending to keep the height below 6 stories in that case. But that, from the top 4th bullet point, is the key one, that if, as this work progresses, we identify that this is tending to work against the overarching intent of the NPSUD around housing opportunities close to transport and the metro and city centre, metro centres, city centres, then we would have to look at it in a bit more detail and have a more balanced approach, in some cases enabling more than the 2 stories that's currently allowed in those situations. There's a key point there that we're not suggesting that if an individual house property within a special character area is of low or medium value, then it's rezoned to enable the 6 stories, but the adjacent properties are kept at 2 stories. There will be a logical zone boundary drawn, and in that case, if it's 1 or 2 properties in a street, then the entire street would, if the rest of the street was high quality, then the street recommendation is that it remains. The practice of spot zoning individual properties is something that we don't have in the unitary plan. You get very perverse outcomes, and so we're absolutely, just to make it very clear, we're not suggesting that this survey work results in a situation where we have pepper potting of zoning that allows 6 stories in amongst predominantly 2 stories areas. It's the area as a whole, it's the street or groups of street as a whole, and their value being either high, medium or low, that would influence the approach that's taken. So I mentioned the survey work, it is underway. We've been asked questions at workshops around what are the factors that the heritage experts are looking at when they do this survey work. Just to be clear, they're not going on to private property. The survey work is from the street. It is what they can see from public spaces, streets or reserves. But they are looking at the scale of the building, its relationship to the street, i.e. how far it's set back from the street, its elevation from the street, what period of development, is it the very early colonial cottage housing, or the sort of 1880s, 1890s, is it through to more the sort of immediately pre-Second World War Californian bungalow style? So it's period of development, typology, well that's moving into, is it a bungalow, a villa, a cottage? Those are the sort of typologies we're dealing with, the architectural style. And I guess the level of physical integrity, how much has it been modified and changed to the point where it really doesn't represent its original character and form. So at a property by property basis, which is what we're required to do under the NPS urban development to retain anything like the character areas, this is the sort of assessment that has to be undertaken. Really, that's just the detailed wording from the report. And I think that's probably it from me, but we have a team of us here who can certainly answer any questions you might have on the recommended approach.
I think probably the questions around the criteria. I think Noel, you're manager of Heritage. I think it's probably, although John has given an outline, I think we need to look at that more closely about the criteria, the methodology, how you go about it. If you could expand, please.
Certainly. The unitary plan currently contains objectives and policies relating to special character. Each special character area has a character statement. What we have gone through is those objectives, policies and character statements and identified the key elements from them which an area would need to meet to qualify as special character. So that it is from our existing unitary plan provisions. It was interesting, in preparation for this meeting, I was reading some of the character statements last night. They are very comprehensive. Each area statement is 6 to 10 pages long, and it is quite detailed about the values for each area. And each area, not all areas are the same.
And the last time we looked at the special character areas was in 14-15, leading up to the early draft?
So we've never looked at these special character areas via survey. What we did look at was the pre-1944 survey, which was adding to the existing special character provisions. The exception to that is through the unitary plan, I think we added about 2 or 3 special character areas, the most notable one being the Balmoral tram suburb.
Okay, the other area there's been some inquiry on is probably a question for you, Alistair, and that's on the walkable catchments. You've provided me with a desktop analysis of some pages on where you've looked can you just take us through on how we've arrived at, and it's not precisely 800, it's not precisely 1200, it's around or approximately 800 or approximately 1200 for city centre, isn't it? Can you just take us through how you've arrived at recommending around 800 and around 1200?
That's right, Chair. It is, I think it's an important point. This is a starting point for consideration. We do need to start somewhere, and all the planners will need to start somewhere when they are looking at rolling out these zones and recommending zones. So we need to land on a starting point. It was likely to be modified through all these. The various distances, the three different types of locations we're talking about, having walkable catchments around. As set out in the report, we are basing it around the different distance an average person would walk. I'm not particularly happy with that term, but it does convey the idea. It's the distance that at least roughly half the population are happy to, can and are willing to walk regularly. So it's not we deliberately are not going the full extent as far as if somebody can walk or is willing to walk to rapid transit. That would be basing our zoning pattern on the distance one person may be willing to walk, and there are some very somebody might be wanting to get their exercise in and their steps in their 10,000 steps. We're not basing it on that. We are trying to using a walkable catchment that most people are willing to walk to access that location. How we arrived at 800 metres for a rapid transit station or a rapid transit stop is there's an awful lot of literature, as you allude to, from overseas, but also from Auckland and from New Zealand around how far people are prepared to walk, or current patrons of rapid transit stations walk to access those stations. They often have a median distance around 800 metres. That varies. There are some that have lower median, some further. For rapid transit station, it tends to sit around that distance. It is, I think, though, important to understand that most of these studies survey people that are currently catching public transport. And this is an important point that I don't think sort of gets overlooked quite often, that it doesn't catch the people that don't catch public transport or are not walking that distance. To do that, you need an awful lot of information around housing density, the number of people living, the number of your jobs there, the number of other activities such as schools. So really all it tells you is the people that are willing to catch public transport at the moment. And I think that's also another reason I'm I recommend not going further than 800 metres, because while some studies, such as our studies by REMOVE, by our Research Investigation Monitoring Unit, show people are prepared to walk 4 kilometres or longer, there are there are a vast greater number of people that don't walk that distance, and we don't have that information of the proportion of people, but we do know it does drop off as you get further away. And so I think that median distance of roughly around 800, which is also in line with long-founded, long-used rule of thumb of 800 metres is appropriate. It is also in line with many international examples, urban design guidelines, planning, structure planning guidelines that often use 800 metres for walkable catchment. For metro and city centres, there is probably a bit less specific information around those ones. There is still, though, a lot of studies, in particular from environmental health and the like, around the impact of shops and centres on people walking, and that shows a similar sort of thing, that it drops off as you get further, and roughly around that distance of 800 metres tends to be fairly consistent of the impact in relationship to walking. The other thing that we do have, as John said earlier, for metro and city centre is how far people will walk from the journey to work and journey to education data from the census. And so we've been able to look at that and see sort of a clear drop-off around, for metropolitan centres, somewhere between 600 to 1,000 metres. It's a little hard to tell. We've got these big census zones, and obviously it will probably drop off within that zone, but roughly around that distance from the metro centres. And likewise from the city centre, between about 1,000 and 1,500 metres from the city centre, the edge of the city centre, that sort of level of walking to journey to work and education starts to drop off around that point. So yeah, that's sort of how we reach that figure. I would note, especially for metropolitan centres, I think we will, as I say, this is a starting point. Metropolitan centres possibly will differ a little more than some of the others, I'd imagine, the walkable catchments, and we will continue doing work to try and look at the differences between those walkable catchments of those centres.
Starting point, and there's work to do. We'll go to the questions now, and I've got a number, starting with the Deputy Mayor.
Well, thanks. And just my own information, that distance is the metro, what is that in time, do you think, for the average person, for 1,200 and 800?
Generally, we assume most people are fairly comfortable walking speed is around 400 metres is about 5 minutes. So basically we're talking a 10-minute walk or a 15-minute walk. But we've used distances here we are intending to use, that's a more proxy for time, because topography and the like will obviously slow people down. So that's why that sort of modifying factor comes in.
Thank you. And the second question, very briefly, again, Mr. Chairman, is, John, ferry terminals, would they be part of further work, potentially?
Ferry terminals. It's probably one for Alistair, actually. He's looked into that issue there. I know in the past, just can't recall what the answer was.
Under the NPS, it clearly defines rapid transit as road or rail. So ferry terminals clearly don't fall under that. In future, the council could clearly choose to apply it for consistency, but it wouldn't be able to rely on the NPS saying that we have to upzone that for 6 stories. So, but at the moment, none of our ferry services meet the frequency that we consider for to be rapid transit.
But John, just to follow on from the Deputy Mayor's point, that could be something that we explore as we explore other areas.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So when
so that's next month's report. We'll look at all those other areas, and we have to look at areas with high accessibility. So it may be that factors into an assessment of accessibility outside the walkable catchments. Yeah.
I think the Deputy Mayor is referring to the planned Kawakawa Bay ferry. Go to Mayor Goff, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Look, whether a special character area meets the definition of being a qualifying matter depends on whether you judge it as being high, medium or low quality. And that's going to be the critical issue. And I still haven't got my head around how subjective or how objective high, medium or low will be, and what the criteria is that you can judge that against. You'll have an army of people out there, 30,000 houses. They're not going to be spending an hour and a half looking at each, obviously. It's going to be pretty quick and dirty, I imagine. But your success in some ways will be judged on whether, when you say that's high quality, there'll be general agreement, or if that's low quality, there'll be general agreement. So can you give us some more specificity around what high quality looks like as against medium or low?
Certainly. There are 6 criteria that each site would be measured against. That was in the slide that John put up. Each one gets a point or a 0 as it meets that criteria. The exception is level of physical integrity, and it could get a negative score. High at this stage is you have to get 5 out of 6. So it's high. The reason being is special character under the RMA is a Section 7 matter, and in a cost-benefit analysis, it's reasonably easy to justify. Up against an NPS that has a directive to intensify, that cost-benefit analysis is different. So it would be pretty difficult to justify low areas on a cost-benefit analysis.
So I'll ask you a question that you probably won't want to answer. Of 30,000, do you have any estimate at all of how many will meet the definition of high? I'm prepared to take a band rather than a single percentage.
Well, no, I can't answer that question. What I would say is that I suspect the answers will vary across the region, and I suspect it would be for 2 reasons. Some of these areas have been subjected to redevelopment to a much greater extent than others. You mentioned the 18,000 building consents that have been issued. I wouldn't be surprised if there's that many consents for redevelopment, and a large portion would be in these special character areas based on how busy the heritage unit staff are processing those applications. So that will amend those areas against the character statements. The second issue is that many of these areas were rolled over through legacy plans and weren't subjected to the same rigour that, for instance, the pre-1944 layer was in, and they weren't even really tested through the unitary plan process. That was not a very controversial process in terms of special character.
So my last question through you, Mr. Chair, is when are you likely to have completed this work and be able to give us the percentage that you've avoided giving us so far?
We will give it to you when we're told to.
Great reply.
Straight out of Yes Minister. You must have a bit of a time frame for how long it'll take you to do the work.
So I would imagine that for the walkable catchments, we would be able to give the answer to that this calendar year. All other areas, that's a different scenario, and we would need to rethink that.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll go to Councillor Newman.
Thank you. I'm a bit incredulous about this process, Noel, respectfully, that you're working through, noting that the NPS is a government policy statement that effectively says this is what the government wants us to do, and if you are going to apply an exception, it better be very exceptional. So can I understand just the mechanics, because you're responding to the Mayor's question. I know how long it takes me to knock on doors. I mean, talk me through it. I mean, is there, is a person with a clipboard standing outside someone's house going through these 6 points, roughly how long do you expect that person to be making that visual assessment? How many assessments per day is one of your team members supposed to be doing?
Look, I'm sorry, I haven't got that information, but we will be doing it as quickly as we can. We've started the pilots, and once we've completed some of those pilots, we will then be able to answer that question with a lot more specificity than what I can at the moment.
Approximately how many people are engaged currently or will be engaged to undertake this work, walking the streets with their clipboards, doing these assessments on the side of the road?
About 6 staff full time.
Okay, and the processing of the information as they tick the boxes and do the tallying up and reporting all of that, they're doing the on-site assessments as well as the write-ups basically, because...
we live in an age of fantastic technology. They won't be using clipboards, they'll be using iPads, and that will directly, have the information that we can push a button and say, show us all the sixes.
Okay.
I guess one of the reasons why I have difficulty answering the question, because the pre-1944 layer, the technology wasn't as good and it took a bit longer, whereas technology's improved a lot. So hopefully that back-end work will be done a lot quicker.
I mean, the officers stand by this approach to really work to defend the high quality stuff. I'm really struggling to understand the value proposition behind some of this, given that this is a national policy statement specifically to unlock development, to address matters, not to protect these locations.
That's not how I read the recommendations. What I read the recommendations is that where areas are high and they significantly constrain capacity, then we would look at a much finer grained solution to that issue and come back to you. So it's not a black and white situation.
Do you have any estimate at the moment as to how many streets could end up effectively being, meeting this criteria in order to avoid the pepper potting heritage protections?
No, I can't. It's a similar question that the Mayor asked me. I can't answer that question, but what I can say to you is that you will be faced with some difficult decisions.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now go to Councillor Casey.
We had the light rail establishment people before us yesterday talking about them going out to consult over the light rail routes in July and August. Are they going to be telling people that the alternative routes, say Sandringham Road and Dominion Road, can have 6 stories along them? And if not, why not?
Through the chair, maybe I'll just... there is work going to be undertaken through that process, which includes some of our staff around, from a land use perspective, what a light rail route would need. So from a purely economic perspective, but also desirable in terms of amount of people, patronage, etc., etc. So there's land use work, which would be intensification, being done as part of that. I would need to check the questions. There's a survey and a website that the light rail team have, I think it's opened up today. I'd need to check the questions there, but no, they're not going out to talk about what it could look like or any sense of minimum 6-story here or 10-story here or 2-story here. That's not what they're going to do. But part of the work required to go back to Cabinet ultimately will be what would those routes need to look like land use wise, maybe value capture, all of that kind of stuff, in order to actually make light rail work or whatever mode we're talking about to make that work. So that is not a specific thing that is going to go out as a proposal, but people may well give their views about it though.
Yeah, I think the least that they should be doing is asking for the views, for sure. Yeah.
I'll check.
It didn't come up yesterday. This is kind of...
Yeah, I'll check the questions and I can pass that on. I don't recall specific that they're going to have specific conversations about this, but it'll come up in the overall. But I will check those questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Coombe, please.
Thank you. I have 3 succinct questions. The first one, this is more for clarification because Megan talked about it in her introduction and so did the chair. But I think it's important just to really confirm that we've still got another stage of looking at other areas, and the criteria for those other areas is where those other areas are accessible to jobs, education, etc., or in high demand. So that will be a look across the whole of Auckland. So, because the report doesn't actually refer to that next step, I don't think, in terms of just how specific it is, or how wide-reaching it will be. So I've got, just to confirm that is right, that's what we will be looking at, and that's the criteria.
It is correct, and if you look at the recommendations, it is, which one is it? Sorry, what was that, John? D. It is the D, yep.
D,
It is,
I think there is one brief paragraph in the report.
And
that,
there is a
doesn't
paragraph.
stand there.
Okay, apologies, I didn't, but I guess it's also, okay, D doesn't say that to me, but I think it's just, you know, there is a bigger, much bigger, broader bit of work that will capture a whole lot more, and what will be applied there will be a minimum of 6 stories as well to these other areas.
Through the chair, no. What the NPSUD says, in the other areas, height and density must be commensurate with the level of accessibility or demand, whichever is the higher. So it's quite a interesting concept that we've workshopped with you and had some challenges, particularly in terms of defining where the areas of high, medium and low demand for housing are in Auckland. But in terms of accessibility, there is a methodology that we can use that Alistair's involved in with others in defining areas in terms of their level of accessibility, but it doesn't specify that areas of high demand or high accessibility must be 6 stories. It says they must have a height and density commensurate with that. And that might be 2 stories, it might be 3 stories, it doesn't necessarily mean 6, but that'll be covered in the next report. And yes, that does also have a bearing on special character areas, because some of the special character areas are outside of the walkable catchments, as you well know.
Yeah.
But the NPSUD is requiring heights and densities that may be different to the unitary plan, even in those areas. So we just felt that was, well, we're just not there yet with our policy work to bring a report to you, but by next month we will be. Yep.
Thank you for that clarification. Next question is around you've defined it as walkable catchments from rapid transport, the rapid stops on the rapid transport network, whereas it just, the MPS actually refers to rapid transport stops. So does that change, does that narrow the definition or where we're looking at in terms of those walkable catchments? Like, is that a wider, if we were just looking at or frequent, it talks also about good quality transport or frequent transport. Have we narrowed the definition at all by referring to RTNs? Or I might be misunderstanding.
Not intentionally. If any differences in phrasing are probably just through drafting. It is intended to be the same thing that we interpret as what it was meant by the NPSUD.
And I guess my question to that is around, with the light rail, when we get a route landed on, that will be an RTN. Will this process allow us to then review the walkable catchments from those stations?
Once that route is confirmed as an RTN, then the policies that we're talking about today around the 6 stories would apply at that point. But until we have that route locked in and the stops on that route absolutely confirmed, we can't sort of predetermine that and start looking at zoning approaches. So it's a bit of a timing issue. But if, for example, that occurs after next August, we would almost certainly have to do another plan change for that route. So it'd be an iterative process. So if we knew exactly where light rail was going to happen now, and that was confirmed, mapped in the RLTP, with its stops well known, then we would be applying this approach right away. But because light rail isn't at that point yet, we'd be preempting things to do that work now. So it is a timing issue, but sooner or later, if and when light rail is confirmed, then these policies would apply. And if it's not part of the plan change next August, it would be one shortly thereafter to do the same approach along that corridor. So
That's
we're not
useful to
missing
know
anything.
around the and will it be iterative too in terms of other potential frequent transport networks or more services or routes?
The way the MPS Urban Development is written, it is iterative right the way through its whole life and the entire life of the unitary plan. Every time there are fundamental changes like rapid transit routes and stops, then we have to do a plan change. When we do the capacity modelling work, and if that shows in the next report that there is a capacity issue, we have to look at potential unitary plan changes. So it's very much written in an iterative way, that it's not next August we're done and dusted with the MPSUD.
Right, that's really useful to clarify. And did I hear you say, John, that this is around the high quality assessment, which the Mayor asked a question I was going to ask, because it's very how you arrive at high quality. But did I hear you say that surveying is already underway?
It is underway. We've just got going in the last few weeks. I guess having held a couple of workshops on this, we didn't get a steer that we should put the brakes on and not do this piece of analysis to get the evidence.
Yeah, fair enough.
There are other options for the committee, but we felt out of the workshops that it made sense to just start the work, given how much work is required and the time frame we've got. So it is underway. It is street-based. If our staff are asked any questions, they're explaining that they're doing some heritage survey work in light of the MPSUD. So
No, fair enough. And sorry, and finally, Mr. Chair, I think it might be just really useful. I know the report covers it, but to really clarify what the public input, the engagement is going to be, and when we can anticipate that, because I think that is kind of a key point that's creating a high level of anxiety around, will the public be able to have input into this? So can that be clarified too, please?
My speaker is on now. So it is covered, and it's an additional recommendation under C, and we'll be seeing that approach brought to us in August. Correct, John?
the engagement approach, yep, that's August.
But can it just be clarified what exactly, like, will the engagement be around, sort of influence, we'll be able to influence things like the walkable catchment, we'll be able to influence things like what an RTN is. It would be useful just to clarify the level, what are we talking about, what will be consulted on?
John, do you want to...
Well, there are options, and we will explore those options and put a recommended approach in that report, and then you will make that decision on engagement in August. So, yeah.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you. Councillor Watson, please.
In light of some of the responses, I've got a few questions or concerns about the special character areas overlay, not least of which is what we're actually dealing with. So as much as the people that are going around doing the surveying, will have a sense of what's medium or low quality, I certainly don't know. I don't know specifically, other than that map, the specific streets or neighbourhoods that are affected. So I've got a sense that I, certainly as someone who's making a decision here today on these recommendations, I'm flying a bit blind. So for instance, if I look at the recommendations that go to 1, 3 and 4, so the first one to do with these setback controls, and these are areas of high quality I'm talking about here, so not medium or low, these are high quality areas. What that would actually look like in practice, that would be useful. Similarly, with the point 3, where again we are looking to rezone or enable building heights in a high quality area, what sort of streets or amenity or heritage or whatever it might be is there, and finally what medium and low is, because obviously as the years tick by, something that wasn't so historic maybe 20 or 30 years ago is becoming into that historic lens. So and this is partly to you, Mr. Chair, do we have an opportunity to actually examine real life examples of what's being proposed here at some point, or to revisit it, because that's not the way I read the recommendation.
Yep, it's a good point. When I moved to Ponsonby, all the verandas were all closed in and they were lived in, and you would not have viewed them as special character, and today they are. So, Noel, can you take us through that as best you can? I know you've only undertaken the pilot to date. It's more about that methodology and...
I guess the key part to your question is answered by what we're asking for now is a direction. We're not asking for the end result. How much information you want to make that final decision, let us know. If you want to see the maps, if you want to see the come out and do some surveys. Okay, well, we're looking for volunteers. So I guess that we've been through...
I'll volunteer.
There's another one line.
I might not let you near the iPads, but you can certainly drive the car. So I guess in a general sense, that is the answer. We're not asking for the level of detail that you're requesting at the moment. We're just asking for the direction. How you would deal with setbacks in the special character business areas will be a matter of detail. So if we were coming back to you and saying, yes, we think we can retain these special character business areas and still have 6 stories, we would then also need to be including the controls that would allow that to happen, and you would see that. And just on that special character business, currently you can build through a restricted discretionary application in a lot of these areas up to 5 stories. So going to 6 isn't that big a step from a special character perspective. There are other issues at play, and if you look at some of the issues where in Dominion Road, for instance, the issues that at play there were effects on adjoining residents rather than effects on special character.
I'll reserve my right to speak quickly to that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Now I've got about 9 members with questions. The next is from Councillor Cooper.
Right, it is about that setback. Is there any rationale about the value of that? I'm just wondering how much land you can't use and how much it restricts any options anyway. Is it, I mean, in other places around the world where you see old and new together, they're not like, oh, a gap at the back, they're all together and they look pretty cool. So I just wondered what the rationale for that is, especially when it could minimise the amount of land available.
Yeah, exactly. It's perhaps unfortunate we got into that level of detail because setbacks was just as an example. What we're saying is we think there is a planning solution in these business areas to retain special character values and achieve the levels of intensification that the NPS requires. And one way to do that may well be setbacks.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. I've got a few questions, if I may, Chair, but I'll be as quick as I can. Are we confident that the approach we're proposing today will be meeting objectives and policies of the NPSUD at a broad level?
Yeah, that's so while there's the absolute thrust on intensification in these areas, and there's a very explicit, very specific 6 stories mentioned, the fact that a council is able to add to the list of matters that could qualify indicates that the government did have an intention that councils could look at other factors that may limit that. So, but I guess that's why we've really put in the one around the need for balance. If when looking at it in the round, retaining the high quality special character areas is working against the overall intent of the NPSUD, then we're saying that that needs to be explored a bit further and a balance struck. But at this point in time, we certainly wouldn't be recommending an approach that's at odds with the NPSUD. So at this point, we believe these recommendations are in line. Thanks, but until the work's done, I guess that's, we'll see the evidence coming through.
Thank you. I want to question slide 13. Changes at the street or area level. What you're proposing, in my mind, seems fairly conservative, especially when you're reading the objectives and policies of the NPS. When you state perverse outcomes of spot zoning, what do you mean exactly?
That's in a street, a property would be zoned single house, only able to build 2 stories, and the neighbouring properties on both sides will be able to build 6 stories. So that would be a bit of a perverse outcome to retain the one building at 2 stories and enable taller on the other side. Or perhaps the other way around would be the more common one. In a street that was mainly 2 stories, we would suddenly have a single property that was maybe or 2 adjacent properties that could go 6 stories. It would be quite an odd long-term outcome if that was the situation.
So just to follow up on that, do you not feel that older character buildings can coexist and intermingle with newer construction in a way that enhances an overall area?
I'll probably hand over to Emma on that, or Noel, because the Heritage team have done a lot of thought about that and have generally landed a position that in the residential character areas, 2 stories is the starting point. Beyond that starts to compromise it. It's not that you can't in any situation whatsoever, but it starts getting more difficult to be in keeping with the character once you go beyond 2 stories.
So just to add to that, where the results we'll come back to you with, we will be coming back to you with advice at a street and an area based, not a site specific base. So we wouldn't be saying, our advice to you wouldn't be to retain a street of special character where 3 of the sites didn't meet the criteria and you put up 6 stories. If that's how I think you were, yeah, because that is the perverse outcome. Yeah. I mean, those 6-story apartments would invariably alter the character of that street to the point where why limit the rest of the street from 6 stories?
Okay, that makes sense. Just one last quick one, just so I can understand the operation of all of this. So if a house, or say several houses in this example, has high special character, but the interests of Aucklanders in intensified housing is also very high in that area, do we do a balancing exercise, or does this operate as a handbrake for development?
That's a political question.
It is. Kia ora. Councillor Hills.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. One is a political question. So for the people around the room, maybe the public, so public and committee members, I can't find the Māori Party's view, but all 4 other parties in Parliament support this, and actually the opposition wants it to go harder. So we cannot, can you just clarify right now that we cannot not do this? Whatever happens, we will be forced to do this, even if there's a change of government, because they support this.
Well, it's a statutory requirement under the Resource Management Act that this council and other councils give effect to the national policy statement. And in this one here, we have to give effect to it by next August. So not doing that would open the council to judicial review. And obviously it's completely at odds with what the government's intentions are. But it's from a legal point of view, we have to implement these changes by next August.
Thank you.
Sorry, next August is the date that they're put up for public submissions. There's still a process after that for public involvement through to hearings. But
thank you.
Yeah.
On walkable catchments, I mean, when we put out our, and I haven't looked at it, Mayor Goff, right now, but in the past we've celebrated apartments and terrace housing within a 1,500 metre catchment of RTNs. Like, we always single that out. Like, isn't that great news that we've got all this development happening within 1,500 metres? This building is 1,000 metres from Britomart. I walk up from Quay Street every day, over 900 metres to our office, and we are choosing 800 metres, and I wouldn't have assumed that 800 metres is average. It seems quite short. And if you think of bringing a radius, moving it in actually limits development quite a lot. So why aren't we going 1,000 metres or more around the bus and train stations?
Through the chair, I think Alice has already answered that. And just, Alistair does have to race off.
I have
to run 1,000 metres down to the ferry terminal.
Right now to catch the ferry in 5 minutes, I think. So I think Alice better go, and we might need to pick that one up and perhaps give you some the references that the chair received with some of the background of where that 800 and 1,200 is derived from. Yeah. So I do think you need to scoot and grab that ferry.
Well, I guess, Chair, for you then, and I may have to leave before the vote, which is becoming awkward, but what if we are limiting this 800, does that mean we don't get the options coming back?
No,
I
we're
want
not
to see.
limited.
I would love
the
to see
motion is
plans.
around, and we've got further work to do. And just remember, it's from the edge, John, it's from the edge of the metropolitan or city centre, isn't it? It's not from a centre point.
Yep, it's from the edge. And I think you'll see in the report next month that we also have to look at other areas of high accessibility that might be just on the edge of the walkable catchment. So it's not as though NPS urban development stops at the walkable catchment and the 6 stories necessarily disappears down to whatever's in the entry plan at the moment. If areas beyond that are still highly accessible, high demand, council needs to respond to that with an appropriate height and density. So, yeah.
Yeah, and last quick question, is Rosedale Station on the busway, will that be included? Because that's being built at the moment. So I understand the light rail, but surely a station that is being built would be included.
It'll be included. It'll be included. It's on the
It's
RTM.
linked back to the RLTP and a map that's in the RLTP, so I'm pretty sure those future stations are part of that. Yep.
Okay, Councillor Walker, please.
Got a few questions. The first one's a political question, and essentially...
So for the political questions, the staff cannot answer.
It also runs with this, so I'll just express it. There's going to be huge interest on the part of Aucklanders
We
in
do
this.
need to go to the question this time, though.
Yep, I'm going to, very quickly. So, can we get information out before August? It could be late August. The people living in these areas are going to have an intense interest. We should put the maps out there so that we're as transparent as possible. Can we do that?
Can I answer that through the chair? No, because we haven't done the work yet. We wanted to get the direction. We also do want to come back to you in August to get your okay on the plan that we do have between now or August and August to talk about these things and what are we going to do about it and when and how we can do it. So I can't promise and I don't want to promise to do anything earlier than that.
My concern, Mr. Chair, is this is a public meeting. We've already had a map presented to us that delineates areas covered off by 800 metres. So that is public. People can see that. We should have some explanatory information about this because there is huge public interest. We may not have the detail, but at least we should be informing Aucklanders as to what's going on, because we know through the unitary plan process there was huge interest in protecting
what's the question?
Character. That we put some information out. For example, the map that we
That was
have.
your first question, and
Yes.
you're really just reiterating it. So
That's correct.
And we've had the
'Cause I gotta
reply, and we will come to that point. We will come to that point. Councillor Fletcher, please.
I had a few questions.
Okay, how many
So
have
that
you
was
got?
one question. The other question I've got just goes to the relationship between those character matters and others. For example, if I look at that picture by Peter Siddle there, you've got the relationship between the monga, the view shafts, obviously historic character, vegetation. Is there going to be some consideration around that? So it's not simply looking at special character, it's the relationship that goes to the topography, the volcanic landforms, all of that.
We're going back to the criteria there, aren't we, Noel? So you've told us what the criteria are.
I guess what I'd say is, and I think I covered it, every special character area has a slightly different character statement and identifies different values. And we're only looking really at those values that limit height and density.
question I've got just goes to resource, and it follows on from the questions that elucidated that maybe there are only 6 people. Given the importance, I would suggest, that Auckland is attached to this, is it not possible to have more resource so we do as good a job as we can? We've already had some volunteers.
No.
Look, I think we've got enough drivers of the cars now, but fully qualified people that can make this judgment that will need to be defended potentially in a court, that they are few and far between. In fact, council is the one that has them in the heritage unit. When we've gone to consultants to seek help, they are full-time. They're busy. They're processing the 18,000 resource consents for new buildings.
My last question just goes to the issue that Councillor Watson raised around what does this look like. So, for example, in a situation where you've got a high-quality area, conceivably there could be a cul-de-sac off it and it might have some low-quality stuff in it. Could we have the perverse situation where you've got 5, 6-storey buildings in one part of a larger character overlay that looks just really shocking? Is that sort of perverse outcome possible?
Without doing the survey, we can't answer that. And the what-if scenarios will become real situations when we present the evidence to you.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher, your call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to bring it back to special character business, as Councillor Watson had started on. I know that we're just looking to give you some guidance in terms of direction, but can we factor into this some of the difficulties that we're experiencing around earthquake-proofing buildings? Is that a factor that will be taken into consideration?
Not for the purposes of this survey, because what we'll be doing with special character business is looking at a planning solution to potentially enable more height and density. And as a side benefit, that may well improve the economics for earthquake strengthening.
Yes, that was really where I was trying to come from. And can you also confirm that when the unitary plan was put through, there was quite a bit of controversy around the pre-1944 issue and the lack of doing an individual survey on each property, and therefore there is some ambiguity in terms of the decision-making that went through at that time on these qualifying matters of special character overlays.
That is correct. The difficulty we had with the pre-1944 is we notified a plan that included the pre-1944 layer and hadn't done the work to justify the boundaries of that. Hence, we would be saying you need to do this survey work so you have all the evidence before you go out with a plan change of whatever sort.
So we were told at that time that we didn't have the resources at that time. What gives us the confidence, and with respect, I know that the shortage that we have of people who are experts in this area, what I don't want to hear in a month's time is that you just didn't have the people or the skill set. What gives us the confidence now that you feel that you have it?
We are only focusing on the walkable catchment areas at this stage, and we're confident that we can deliver the survey results for that. The issue of whether we can do all other areas, we would need to come back to you on that once we have done enough survey work to answer the questions Councillor Newman raised around how many people per site, that sort of level of detail. We just don't have that answer yet for all other areas.
And may I say, because I don't intend to speak on it, I realise how very, very hard this issue is, and I compliment you, Noel, and the team for the work that you've brought to us today.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I will now go to Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
it seems to me like our approach seems quite narrow. So I'm wondering why isn't our approach, here is how you can get the most houses, as opposed to what seems to be gathering evidence to come up with exceptions?
Well, through the chair, we know that many, but not by any means all, Aucklanders place significant value on these areas. We know that they tell a lot about Auckland's history of development, the way that people lived between 1840 and 1945. We know that there's a lot of architectural heritage in there. To some, that's not important at all, but to some Aucklanders, that's very important. Not just the people that live in those areas, but to Aucklanders that live beyond those areas. We know that because under the legacy councils, particularly Auckland City Council, North Shore City Council, these areas were highly valued by many people. So yes, it's a new paradigm. Yes, we're in a situation where there is a significant housing challenge. But we also know the Unitary Plan has created huge opportunities for housing outside of these areas, in areas that are often still very accessible to public transport and amenities. So that's why we're proposing a balanced approach and recommending keep the high value areas. If that's still having a big impact on capacity, then we should look at other alternatives. But the option of not having this as a qualifying matter at all is one that we didn't support, and so we haven't put that forward.
But just to add to that, that is if you wish to make a decision that special character is not a qualifying matter, you can make that. What we are recommending, based on everything that John has said, decisions of this council and previous councils and legacy previous councils, is that this is an issue of interest, and therefore we think we need to do a bit of work for you so that you can make that decision. That decision still could be that it's not a qualifying matter at all, or it could be yes it is, and there are certain areas which we want to keep, and then there are others which we will not. So that's where we've come. We've tried to balance it, but you could say it's not a qualifying matter at all, and then we wouldn't have to do the work. And well, that's probably not quite true, because we would need to have evidence as to why it's not a qualifying matter. But that is a decision that you can make. We're recommending you don't make that now. We do a bit of work, but you could go there.
And just to remind the members, how we've got to this point is that through the workshops, we confirmed that we wanted the staff to work this body of work up and identify special character areas as a qualifying matter. That's why it's here now. It is here because of our earlier direction, feedback through the workshops. Mayor Goff.
Yeah, my question's very specific. What percentage of the special character areas on this map that we've got in front of us are actually within the walkable catchment areas? Because when I look at it, in terms of distance from the city centre, metro centres, or rapid transit networks, most of it isn't within walkable distance. So you're not talking about surveying 30,000 houses at all, I presume.
Yeah, Mayor Goff, just a quick conference with Noel there. We don't have the answer. We'll certainly get that answer. It's not too hard to figure out at all. It's probably in the order of 50 to 60% is our gut feel, is within those walkable catchments of the city centre and the RTN stations. But the special character areas on the North Shore are excluded, the eastern suburbs excluded, and some parts of Grey Lynn probably excluded from walkable catchments at this stage, but as we've foreshadowed, the report next month is dealing with other areas of high accessibility and high demand where the MPS is saying there has to be height and density commensurate with that level of accessibility and demand. So the priority areas that are being surveyed, it's roughly 50 to 60%, which is maybe 16,000 properties. But we'll get that figure. It's not hard at all to find that. Yep.
Thank you, Mayor. Just going back to this question of other areas. So for the walkable catchments, the MPS says it shall be 6 stories minimum, correct? So you're at risk, or we are at risk of displacing mixed housing urban and possibly mixed housing suburban. So you won't have the step down effect of apartment and height and density and then mixed housing urban. There's a possibility, depending on how the maps look, that we would have to come back to the other areas work and put in place possibly mixed housing urban where it's suburban, or mixed housing suburban where it's maybe single. I don't know. So this is by making the decisions, when we make the decisions on the walkable catchments, we are still to go to the other areas that are on the edges of those areas of city centre, metros, RTNs, and look at the build back towards the core. I hope I explain myself, John, because I think there's a sense that it's just this walkable catchment where you're going to get the greater density.
So this is really just the first big piece of the jigsaw, and next month is the second big piece, and how we deal with the transition from where the walkable catchment stops at roughly 800, unitary plan may drop down to 2 stories at the moment. Is that the right thing to do, or should on the fringes of it step down to 3 stories and then 2 stories? Because the approach in the unitary plan, as you mentioned, Chair, is to generally step down in the zoning. We had a bit of a principle of if it's the 5-storey terrace and apartment zoning, generally you would transition to mixed housing urban 3 stories and then 2 stories. So the NPSUD is, by directing that 6 stories within the walkable catchment, it is forcing us to have to look at, well, what do we do to transition from there outwards in areas that may be still quite accessible. So next month we'll have a recommendation as to how to deal with that situation. Yeah.
Okay, and final question from me, and this came up in the workshops, John. Some of us were talking about the need to review the design provisions, the design rules. We lost a lot of that through the Auckland Unitary Plan process. There's public expectation, huge public expectation, that what we do build, we build of quality, that it endures, that it creates great environments inside, outside. So you, I understand, your team is looking at that, and that could form part, subject to our future decisions, that could form part of the same plan change. Is that correct?
There has been a separate body of work underway to monitor how effective the unitary plan has been at achieving design quality. And so whether that would be a separate change to the unitary plan to deal with some of the issues that have arisen that we would recommend to you, or whether it's part of this plan change, that's something that we'd have to work through with the committee. So it could either be as a single plan change next August, or potentially as 2 separate plan changes. But we have identified some improvements to the unitary plan design provisions that we'd like to bring to you as a committee.
Thank you. End of questions. It's moved, it's seconded. The motions are before us. Note the refinements or the additions to those motions. And I'm now in the committee's hands if you would like to speak to this. Councillor Watson, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I won't be very long. And that was a good answer by John Duguid there in terms of people who do place value on special character in Auckland, and there are a lot, and more than that, there's a feeling amongst many people that certainly I engage with that in the past we haven't put enough value on our special character. If we don't protect those parts of Auckland that do have special character, we don't end up with any special character at all, or very limited amount. I mean, for instance, in the weekend I came down and had a walk around Ponsonby. The last time I was in Ponsonby was the 1960s. It was a slightly different social milieu back then, I can tell you. But it's a pleasant place to be. It adds to the vibrancy of Auckland. It's something that enriches everyone, not just the people that live there. It's a kind of living history. So I do see a few concerns here arising from some of the recommendations in the special characters overlay, and the kind of lack of clarity, and I acknowledge there's work to be done and stuff to be brought back and all the rest of it, but the general approach in 1, 3 and 4 I find a little concerning in terms of really opening up the undermining, the undercutting, the removal of protections that would otherwise exist, and I don't think that that's a very a very desirable outcome. And I say that especially in light of everything else we've heard on this NPS today, where in some ways and I know, we're obligated to go through this, but we've been through this process quite laboriously a number of years ago at great cost, $35 million. We went through that unitary plan, caused a lot of angst. We're under the pump there to accept everything, so there's virtually no exceptions there, a lot of political pressure from Wellington at the time, and we just rolled over. And, here we are again, a few more years down the track, and largely for a bit of political window dressing as far as I can see. We're going through another process that's going to probably undercut what already exists, and which had a lot of time and effort and thought put into it. So that's kind of fundamentally objectionable, and there doesn't seem to be any outlet to register that opposition. I'm sure there's a few colleagues around here would like that opportunity to actually just say what a, almost farcical this process is in light of Auckland's standing with the unitary plan. Yeah. So, Mr. Chair, rather than opening it up for another version of Rome and the Barbarians, where we just sack what remains of parts of our heritage, I'd prefer us to put up a little bit of a stand on a few matters here, rather than just rolling over. When the super city was set up, some of the political commentators cast a warning to the politicians in Wellington, say you might be unleashing a beast here that might circumvent you at some point. I don't think they had much to worry about, but that being the case, I think in an issue like this, where there is special character, where it has been recognised, we have just been through a whole process a number of years ago to protect these few remaining areas in Auckland, that we do err on the side of protecting special character rather than accommodating, the knockdown and bowl over and put up more expensive housing that we know that people can't afford anyway. That seems to me to be a rather perverse result. So on that basis, Mr. Chair, I'll be recording my opposition to, and while there are some very, admirable recommendations here, I will be recording my opposition to 1, 3, and 4 in the special characters overlay recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mayor Goff, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to speak in support of the recommendations. I don't regard this as a farcical exercise. This is a very serious exercise where we've got to find a balance between the conflicting objectives of the desirability of intensification, particularly around the city centres, the metro centres, and the rapid transit hub, and the desire also to protect what's really important to the city, which is its cultural heritage, its architectural heritage. We want to live in a city that hasn't lost its history and isn't a bland city where everything looks alike. We are required to do this by the National Policy Statement, but the National Policy Statement does allow discretion, and that's around qualifying matters. I'm satisfied that we can do this in a way where we can get good quality intensification, the sort of stuff I've seen Auckland put up and the stuff I've seen around the Wyndham Quarter and all of the Wynyard Quarter and all of that. We can do intensification well, but we want to keep those really special areas of high quality. And I think it's simply finding that balance, and I want to credit our officers with actually working really hard to find that balance. We're not going to send the bulldozers in and wipe out the old villas, but we are going to look at areas where they don't match up to the standard, because the job, as they told us, wasn't done particularly carefully in the first instance. So politics is the art of compromise. We're finding the compromise here. Of course, we want to have people living where there's transport centres around the metro centres, around the city centre, and of course we don't want to lose the best of our history and the best of our culture and the best of our architecture. That's our job, to find that balance. I think the officers have got us on the right task, and I support their recommendations.
Thank you, Mayor. And Councillor Young, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quick comment. I support this policy approach, and I'm supportive of higher intensification in the right area, along rapid transit routes and near the town centres. This is done all over the world, and it's necessary to avoid the urban sprawl with the huge congestion and the traffic issues that impacts the quality of the life of Aucklanders. These are the issues we currently know well and that we are facing across the region, particularly East Auckland. However, I do have a concern about the order that the MPAs ask us to do things. I believe we should have a transport connects first and then allow the development. If we look at how long it takes us to deliver our key transport projects, such as CRL, light rail, and the Eastern Busway, communities could be wait years, stuck with the congestion and the high emissions travel until these projects are finally completed. However, I do understand the NPS is a direction from government. I look forward to see more detail from the team as this work continues. Thank you, Chair. 谢谢.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker, please.
Sure. Like Councillor Watson, I have huge concerns around this. As a councillor that sat through innumerable meetings over the unitary plan, I'm certainly aware of the enormous effort that we put in. This is essentially a political issue. The government knows, and we need to be telling them right in the eyes, that we have got more than enough housing provision in Auckland for decades to come. We know that. We know the issue in large part is around affordability, and the government needs to deal with that. So we shouldn't be having to sacrifice precious areas of Auckland, the heritage areas, like the areas in that Peter Siddle painting there, that go to the heart of Auckland. That is what people go to livable cities and great cities to look at. They look at the old architecture. They're interested in human scale. They're the things that are important to people. And it's not just character, it's the relationship between the character of the buildings, the topography, the volcanic landscape, the monga. All of those things are important. And those areas we have got those houses are walkable because people like to walk through them, because there are gardens and rock walls and things that people actually need to engage with. So I've got a huge concern that this balance that we talk about will probably be very predictable. Developers will move in, they'll take out properties, they'll take out all the trees, and you'll have a structure there that won't last the distance. It'll probably be cheap in many instances because many of them are. So I think that Aucklanders deserve to know about this. I raised that issue. There are maps. Those maps need to be out there, and I hope that there's a public outcry because that is what is required if we're going to save the special things that make Auckland what it is.
And Councillor Henderson. I'm calling Councillor Henderson. I've got...
Okay. Just before I go, Chair, just seeking your guidance, if I were to second an amendment, I've already spoken, is that okay?
You can second an amendment if you've already spoken. I think.
You can't move it.
You can't move it.
Can't move it. Fantastic. That's good. Yeah, look, in that case, I'll be incredibly brief. Look, the NPS here is a great opportunity to enable more homes. Let's not forget that. And it's in places where people actually want to live, where young people, where young families want to live. Let's not forget that. We have just heard a couple of hours ago a presentation about the dire situation in Auckland's housing, and it will take us decades to catch up. I'd invite anyone to come to places like Te Aratu Peninsula where we're building huge amounts of housing and it's fantastic and people are largely coping. A lot of people are supporting it. But at the same time, we're restricting housing in some of our precious, our most valuable areas of Auckland where people actually want to live. Look, we've been conservative today, in my view, and we need to be ambitious. The choice of many of my generation and younger is, do I have kids? Or do I try and buy a house? I can't do both. Not anymore. That's horrible. That's not a situation that Auckland should be in. And the fact remains is that places like in the Central Isthmus has the best access to schools, to public transport and to jobs in the whole city. And we need to build houses where there are jobs. We need to follow the objectives and the policies of the NPS, which are very clear. As this process continues, we'll need to find a balance, and it's been correctly pointed out by the Mayor on this. But I'll also point out that from the evidence that we've heard today, we haven't chosen housing in that balance in decades. We haven't chosen it in decades. And we've got a poorer climate for it, and we've got a housing crisis for it that has deepened and continued for a long time. Through this process, we need to ask Aucklanders, but with that balance, we need to now choose housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll now go to Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I think this is an opportunity to reassess what we zoned as special character, because I know from experience that my grandfather lived in a house on Balmoral Road for 70 years, until about 2 years before he died, and his side of Balmoral Road was special character. Across the road, fab. But all the houses look the same. And I look there now, and it's absolutely awful, the house that he sold. No one's looked after it. It's a 1910 villa. It was lovely. It's a tip now. But also, just down the road, great big houses have been allowed to be built, and they don't look anything like these 1910 villas. So, you know, maybe we got it wrong in some of the special character because we didn't have the resources, you know, and we could do this better. We might actually really hone in on the really good stuff, and then the stuff that isn't so great, that we might have kind of roughly said is special character and isn't really. So we might get better protected heritage homes, and we can develop in the areas where, I think as Councillor Henderson said, you know, our younger people are trying to buy houses they'd love to buy closer in so they didn't have to spend all that time and money on getting to work, but they just can't. So they have to go further and further out, and houses are not a hell of a lot cheaper really, but they're tiny. You know, they're not a place. You know, my daughter's saying, well, we'd like to buy one of these apartments, but you can't even fit anybody in it, and we want to have a family. And so I think it might give better affordability closer in. And the thing is, the more places that have really good public transport, you won't have these big anomalies where the places near the rare good public transport are really expensive, and younger people can't even, or people on low incomes can't even get there, as we've seen today, which is really depressing. And if we have more places with good public transport access, it might level the prices out a little bit, you know, because it's not like a diamond that a few people can afford. So I think this is a good piece of work. I don't share the thing that we have to have it all out there now. We need that report in August. We need, you know, if you put stuff out now, it just creates urban myths and people writing in the paper that we've already decided it. You know, we haven't decided it. So I think we put this forward. We've changed some of the recommendations. I mean, I'd prefer a 900 to a kilometre catchment as well, because it's actually 900 metres between Dominion Road and Sandringham Road. So you could still walk there, whichever line was taken. So I just think we've got to get on with the work, let our staff do the work, and we'll have more and more fine-grained information to make any decisions on, and then we'll take that piece of information, which is a bit better informed, out to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper, and I will now go to Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I intended not to speak, but because I understand there may be a division on this, I want to put forward my view. I felt compelled to speak when I heard a member suggest that somehow or another we just have to do this because the government and the opposition are united on it. And I want to say, well, that's bollocks. It's about doing the right thing for Auckland. And that should be our responsibility, not to whether it's Labour or National, whatever political party you belong to. I was really pissed off by that, quite frankly. This is our opportunity. It's just direction setting. It will come back in August. It is an opportunity to correct the mistakes of the unitary plan. There were those of us who desperately wanted a staged approach to the unitary plan and to take it quietly and carefully and to give great consideration to the issues of character and heritage, because they are so important to defining Auckland as we know it and the livable city that it is. I also want, in supporting this, even though I've got great respect for the contribution that Councillor Watson has made, it was always with the intention of optimising investment from the legacy councils who courageously made decisions on the assumption that there would be intensification along the corridors. And that was why someone like myself was so angry during the period of the unitary plan that we gave scant regard to the integrity of the individual assessments for these matters. So this is our chance to revisit it. We've heard today a lot about affordability being the problem. So I'm not saying that this is the great panacea to housing supply in Auckland, but I do know that we would have been in a much better place to go and have better partnerships with the private sector if we had done the whole issue of the character assessments properly at the time of the unitary plan, when we were there were opportunities all over the place with CRL stations, not the least being the Mount Eden station.
Sorry to interrupt you, Councillor Fletcher, but there's quite a lot of talk in the room here, and I would like members to actually listen to Councillor Fletcher, please.
Sorry, I'll start coughing again, and I'm trying to take a big breath so it don't. Affordability is obviously going to be an ongoing issue, but this is our chance to correct it before we make more investment-based decisions. We couldn't look at some of the partnerships that we might have looked at with the Mount Eden CRL station, for instance, because this work didn't really have any integrity. So for that reason and that reason alone, I'm wanting for us to do it once and do it properly. The final decisions aren't being taken today. They'll be taken next month in August. But this is the opportunity for Noel Reardon and his team to undertake the heritage and character matters with rather more detail than was undertaken during the time of the unitary plan. And for that reason alone, I'm looking to support the recommendations today.
Thank you, Councillor. And now I'll go to Councillor Hills.
Yes, Chair, and if you'd allow me to speak before I move the amendment, if I'm going to move an amendment, I just want to have a kind of show of hands, because I've had indications from a few that they're not interested. But my amendment, which could take a long time to debate, I would like to have an amendment of 1,500, 1,000, 1,000, but if it's definitely going to lose, I don't want to put it up. And so if I could just have a show of hands, otherwise I'll move it, and it will take a long time.
Okay, so just to be clear, let's hear what it's. You're saying instead of around 800, it's 1,000, and it's 1,500.
Yes, but what I'm trying to do is, I know everyone has things to go to. If it's going to take an hour to debate, well, you can cut it off here, then I'd rather just not.
Can I ask for a point of order, just for clarity, just point of order, and that may be because of my experience, but isn't it factual that we have to follow a process that if an amendment, and I just want clarity on that, Chair, that if an amendment is put up, has to be put up not to show hands first, to give a sort of straw poll. We're in a public meeting, and I just need clarity around that for my sake, because it just doesn't feel right to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's fair too. We're in debate. Yeah. And if you want to move an amendment, it's normal that you actually prove the points to convince others to support you, or otherwise they can hear your points. On a show of hands, they're not going to have the opportunity to enter into any dialogue in reply to you. So I think we're just going to have to take, if you want to choose to move an amendment, you need to do it at the outset now.
Okay, I would like to move an amendment by replacement of A, B, and C, and make those 1,000 metres.
Okay, just for clarification, are you saying that the replacement is only on the measurement, or is it taking away the word around?
Well, my concern is, Chair, that around is low. If you have around 1,000, it's higher. I'm not convinced we're going to get the options if we take it down to this. I'm happy to take, look, I'll remove it.
Okay, so look, I'll take, if you want to move it, the words are 1,500 metres, so it would start 1,500 metres from the city centre, it would start 1,000 metres from the metropolitan, and the C would start 1,000 from the existing and planned rapid transit. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, we'll take that. And a second in Councillor Henderson, and you're welcome to speak to it.
Thank you, Chair. And it's just briefly, I am concerned that the catchments are too low as a starting point, and I would like to have more options brought back to us from a higher starting point. We've been told it doesn't preclude the 800, but I am worried that we do not have the maps and measurements of what that could be like if we don't have those as a starting point. And my concern is that we are really reduced around the train stations and bus stations, the investment we're currently putting into those, but also the possibility for different options for people. And all people are asking for are more options to live closer to public transport. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're just speaking to the amendment now, and the change is just those numbers, members. The removal of the word around and the addition of the numbers. Okay, we need to be clear. Okay, so I did ask that question and I was told it was the removal of around and with the change in the number. So now we have to add the word around. Is that what you want? Okay, we're adding back the word around on all three. I'm going to go to Councillor Filipaina, who's signalling.
I'm seeking clarification around the process now with this amendment. Yes, I know that we will now discuss it. I want to hear, and I don't know whether it's been clear from the outset, I want to hear what repercussions, if any, with the changes to 1,000 metres and up to 15. The only way we can do that is then get our officers back here to ask the particular question. So that's my clarification around process, because I think it's important, the discussion with what was put up there, and it was the substantive prior to the amendment. We had asked questions around the 800 metres. Now that we've got the amendment and we will have to discuss it unless it's withdrawn, is I just want to hear from our staff as a result of the changes that have been done. So, Chair, I'm just seeking your guidance in regards to the process around that, please.
Thank you, members. Well, we're now in debate and we've asked the officers to withdraw. And I'll just check with our advisors here, but this matter, this suggestion was not raised at the question time. That's the time to raise it. So
Chair,
it puts us all in a difficult position.
And that's the reason for my clarification, is because the questions that were asked of our staff when they were here was around 800 metres. And that's my question of clarification. My understanding is, and Kalinda can correct me, but I think we can still ask, as a result of this being an amendment, that we can still ask our and that's the clarification I want to seek.
Let me seek advice from our governance advisors whether we need leave of this meeting, or what do the standing orders say, Kalinda?
So the standing orders would be silent on that particular point, Councillor Filipaina, but I think there's a danger of the staff getting drawn into the debate if they were to come and speak to this. There were questions earlier about around 800 and around 1,200 metres, and I think the staff talked about why those were set, but also there were some questions asked about what if that was increased and things like that. So I think that area has been covered, and now it's up to you guys to decide, make that decision.
Okay, so members, I think we need to proceed in the debate. The staff have left the chair.
I will withdraw. I'm sorry. It wasn't good process. I don't normally do amendments, but I didn't feel like I got a good answer, but I will withdraw because I believe it can be brought up in the next process. And it's not the normal way I do things, but I felt I didn't get a good answer, but I'll withdraw. Thank you.
Now the meeting needs to agree to withdraw the amendment. Does the meeting agree? I take that to be affirmative.
We agree.
Thank you to all members, those online as well. So the amendment is withdrawn, and we will continue speaking to the substantive motion. Councillor Hills, did you want to talk to the substantive?
Yes, and look, I apologise, Chair. When I asked the question, the answer I really got was the person does have to run 1,000 metres to Britomart at the moment, and I feel concerned that we won't get a full number of options come back to us, but I feel like the staff have probably heard my concerns, and I'm hoping and assuming we will get various options of maps that are more broadly than around 800, which I assume could be more than that. So look, I am concerned that we don't do what we were saying at the beginning of this meeting, which is allowing more options for people, especially around public transport. It is the biggest issue for climate change, for poverty, for homelessness, for options for people to continue to stay in the city. There is not enough options around our rapid transit network and all the investment we are putting in around that network. So I will support this for now, but I am keen to see those maps and options. And it is difficult at this early point for community to understand because we don't have any maps or any of the data. But thank you.